What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and with Comics Explained focusing exclusively on comic books and Pop Culture Explained focusing more on TV, film, different things like that, this video is actually going to go on both channels. Now, I know it's kind of double dipping, but at the same time, it's the only way I really know how to consolidate the difference between the two, so don't hate on me too much. But in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to create a Disney Plus series for Wolverine from the X-Men. I've written out a lot of this, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this, but as we do, there are a few things that I'll stop and explain in order to make it make sense, and that's where the comic book part comes in. So, regarding the X-Men and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because Wolverine is the most popular of the X-Men, both in cinema and comics, it is my belief that while introducing him in a movie is and will be the most likely choice, a one-season-long, 10-episode Disney Plus series can and should expand on information provided by the films. While none of the content will be essential, it will have the benefit of adding to the existing mythos of the X-Men, allowing the Disney Plus brand and the Marvel film brand to effectively feed one another. Now, the reason why I put here that it's not necessarily essential is because Kevin Feige had came out and said that while the Disney Plus series will have things like Falcon and the Winter Soldier and Loki and so on and so forth, he does not want Disney Plus to be treated as an essential read, more or less, for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, in the sense that if you go and you watch like a Fantastic Four movie, that you have to have seen the Disney Plus Reed Richards episode in order to understand what's going on. And that's a smart move, because that would potentially alienate people, because not everybody has the time or the money or both to sit down and watch a 10-episode long series on Disney Plus and then go watch the movie, right? People want to treat movies the way that the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies have been treated, which is self-contained, unless they tie into something else in the films. I think that will change as time goes on, but at the moment, that's the general rule. But getting back into it, because of Wolverine's age within Marvel Comics and presumably the Marvel Cinematic Universe, this adds the benefit of being able to bookend an explanation for the origin of mutants within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, effectively picking up where the Eternals film and presumably the X-Men film leave off. Now, assuming the Eternals film covers the modification of the human genome by the Celestials per the mainline Marvel Comics, see Eternals Volume 1, Issue Number 1 by Jack Kirby, the evolution of mutant kind beyond these early changes would likely be unexplained due to the film focusing largely on the Eternals themselves as opposed to the history of mutants. Something else that I want to point out here that I didn't actually write, the X-Men film would largely focus on the origin of mutants, if for no other reason than for us to understand where they came from. But even with that movie focusing on the origin of mutants, there wouldn't be a lot of time devoted to it, because people are going there to see the X-Men, not to see the origin of the mutant population. And so combining this with Marvel's Ultimate Universe origin of the mutant race not only provides a breadth of content that can be used for the Wolverine television show, but can also create a sense of cohesion by tying into events that have already transpired within the MCU. And so I propose the story of Wolverine combined with the origin of mutants follows this form on Disney Plus. Number 1, the Eternals film and the X-Men film establish the creation of the mutant X gene through genetic modification. This gene remains dormant from the time the genes are modified until the Wolverine series. Now, the reason why I chose this is that in Marvel Comics, something that I want to specify is how mutants came into existence. So in Marvel Comics, mutants came into existence through a couple different ways. You have the main Marvel Universe way, and then you have the Ultimate Universe way, and they're distinctly different. The reason why the Ultimate Universe matters is because the Marvel Cinematic Universe is based largely on the Ultimate Universe. So in the main Marvel Universe line of comics, what you had are these celestial beings that were conducting a universal-wide experiment. And what they would do is they would travel from one world to the next where the inhabitants were very primitive, and they would take a small percentage of that planet's inhabitants and then modify their genes. On the planet Earth, you had what were called the Wanderers. And the Wanderers were largely presented to us in comics as what was in effect the missing link between primate man and modern man, essentially caveman as we would call it. And the idea was that this group, the Wanderers, had their numbers divided into thirds. The first third were taken and had their genes modified in such a way to where they were, in essence, perfect beings. They could manipulate cosmic energies, they could fly, they had super strength and speed and durability and all that kind of stuff. They were not godlike, they weren't able to like alter reality on a universal scale, but they were exceedingly powerful. This group became known as the Eternals. The second group had their genes destabilized so that you would end up having unchecked mutations. And because of the destabilization of their genes, every generation that came after the previous one would have a shorter and shorter lifespan. Now, their lifespan was like eons, right? Like hundreds, if not potentially thousands of years. So you're talking about one generation, they might live for 500 years. The next generation might live for 250 years. The third generation would live for half of that. The fourth generation for half of that. That's how you would kind of see it repeat itself. Now, I'm just using arbitrary numbers here. Marvel is kind of fast and loose with how long this race goes on for, but this group became known as the Deviants. The fact that their genes were destabilized is why they looked so hideous in their appearance. And then the final group had their genes modified in such a way so that two things would happen. The first is that some of these genes would basically become what we call X genes, meaning that during a time of puberty or high duress, those X genes would activate. That's where mutants come from. The second thing that happened is that for those individuals who did not have an X gene, that something may happen over the course of their life that would lend them to gaining powers. This is the way that Marvel explains why it is that somebody like Bruce Banner could be exposed to gamma radiation and not die of radiation poisoning and instead become the Incredible Hulk. Now, switching over to the Ultimate Universe, the idea here is totally different. So in the Ultimate Universe, Steve Rogers was not the original super soldier. Instead, it was Nick Fury. And what ended up happening is that the super soldier serum was used on Nick Fury, but he escaped and went underground and they couldn't find him. But they did verify by virtue of Nick Fury that the super soldier serum works. And so what they did is they brought in Steve Rogers, and Steve Rogers became Captain America. Now, while that was going on with Nick Fury, what ended up happening is that James Howlett was taken by Canada, by the Canadian government, and then inducted to what was in effect the same super soldier experiment. The difference is that they discovered a gene within his body that nobody knew anything about. And so they activated this gene. And when they did, Wolverine developed a healing factor. Following that, they bonded adamantium to his skeleton and he went forward as Wolverine, right? So that's how mutants came into existence. But what also came out of this was that the activation of the mutant gene, that process was essentially synthesized and it was spread throughout the world so that mutant genes all over the world suddenly began to activate. And that's where you get mutants from in the Ultimate Universe. So again, two completely different ways of bringing mutants into the Marvel Cinematic Universe potentially, but they both effectively serve the same purpose. And so moving on, this is when we get into the meat and potatoes of the Wolverine series, okay? So for the Wolverine series, starting off at number 1, the series would follow the life of Wolverine, borrowing from both the mainline Marvel comics as well as the Ultimate Universe line of comics, including his involvement in World War II. This can be done both by using elements of Daniel Way's Wolverine origin comic series as well as flashbacks of Chris Evans' Captain America, and while Captain America would be unaware of who Wolverine was, at the very least, it would create a sense of cohesion with his history alongside the rest of the MCU. And the reason why I chose Daniel Way's Wolverine origin comic series is because Wolverine has had quote-unquote origin comics over the years in Marvel Comics. So if you look at something like Barry Windsor Smith's Marvel Presents Weapon X, that gives you the first depiction of Wolverine's time as part of the Weapon X project becoming Wolverine. The problem with this was that it was a mainstay of Wolverine's character that he never really was able to piece together his past. The significance of Daniel Way's comic run is that in the aftermath of House of M, one of the things that happened is that all of Wolverine's memories were restored. And that comic run focuses on the restoration of those memories and everything he learns about himself that he previously didn't know, right? So that's why that's so important. And of course, seeing him appear as flashbacks fighting alongside Captain America is cool, even if he doesn't really have like adamantium claws or anything yet. Moving on, number 2, due to the death of Captain America at the end of World War II, Hydra had secretly created the Weapons Plus program as a means to produce a new super soldier to replace Captain America, and had been conducting a series of experiments and tests on various individuals as part of the Weapons Plus program. Each of these tests would be designated as a project with a specific numerical value. Now, I know a lot of you guys are kind of curious about this. I'm going to go into this next section and then explain both of these, right? Because the next section is kind of important here. And so following this, number 3, Wolverine would eventually serve as part of Team X in the 1960s. As far as the federal government is aware, Team X operates as a Black Ops team carrying out various missions on behalf of the American government in its efforts to combat communism. Secretly, Team X is used by Hydra, having already infiltrated and taken over S.H.I.E.L.D., and the missions they carry out are targets that stand as a direct threat against Hydra's continued pursuit pursuit of power. The success of Team X and their various missions leads Hydra to believe that they would stand as the best chance of recreating a successful iteration of the newer super soldier program. Now, let's explain these, right? Because this is probably the single most important part of the series and would really tie into a lot of what we see in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? So, as we know, at the end of Captain America: The First Avenger, Steve Rogers was believed to have been dead. He was actually frozen in ice. But the Strategic Science Reserve, as it was created by Peggy Carter and Howard Stark, served the purpose of basically allowing the government's science wing to determine how they would create different people or bring different people in with different abilities and so on and so forth. For example, we saw during Avengers Endgame in a flashback scene that the Strategic Science Reserve was familiar with Brian Braddock, who would later go on to become Captain Britain. There's also additional information to indicate that the SSR was familiar with Joseph Chapman and John Walker. You guys may know these guys as Union Jack or US Agent, respectively. The entire idea behind the SSR, as we know from Captain America: The Winter Soldier, is that with Arnim Zola being brought in as essentially their science head, that he, alongside a handful of others, had steadily begun to regrow Hydra to the point that Hydra had actually started to completely and totally take over S.H.I.E.L.D., but S.H.I.E.L.D. never actually knew that it was happening. Now, why does this matter? Because in Marvel Comics, what you have is Weapons Plus, and Weapons Plus was an overarching program designed to create super soldiers. Now, the motivation behind Weapons Plus's origin has different explanations. For the sake of this video, it doesn't really matter where Weapons Plus came from. What does matter is that Weapons Plus, their first project, also known as Weapon 1, was codenamed Project Rebirth. That was the creation of Captain America. We learned that in Grant Morrison's new X-Men run. Now, Captain America was wildly successful, as we know. He was the first and only instance of being able to create a super soldier serum that could be injected into a human being, and that person would go on to become someone who was the peak of human physical conditioning. The problem is, as we know, Abraham Erskine, the creator of the super soldier serum, died, and there was no way to duplicate the process. And so following the perceived death of Captain America during World War II, that Weapons Plus continued on with its various projects, Weapons 2, Weapon 3, Weapon 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, basically using different iterations or forms of technology to create different types of super soldiers. So you had people like Frank Simpson, for example, who had cybernetic implants grafted to his body, and he also had this kind of mental conditioning where he would have different pills that he would take, for example. One pill would amp him up, one pill would keep him steady, another pill would bring him down, different things along those lines, right? Grafting cybernetic implants to animals, trying to find ways to control them, and so on and so forth. For the second part of this, in terms of Wolverine serving on Team X, in Marvel Comics, Team X was a Black Ops wet work team, and the idea was that they basically existed as a joint venture between the United States CIA and Canada's Weapons Plus. And the idea was that they would basically carry out a series of missions that were designed to either combat communism or to take out various threats to the United States. They toppled dictators and all kinds of stuff. Now, eventually, Team X was disbanded, but the idea was that when the team was disbanded, it was about 3 or 4 years before Weapons Plus realized, hey, like, we know these guys have superpowers, we know they have things like a healing factor, let's create a new iteration of the Weapons Plus program, we'll call it Weapon X. And that's where you got Wolverine having adamantium bonded to his skeleton by virtue of Professor Thornton and Carol Hines and Professor Cornelius. And so that's why these things matter, because what we're doing here is we're basically saying that Captain America was not part of Weapons Plus. He predates it. But when Hydra took over S.H.I.E.L.D., that Hydra created Weapons Plus as a means to find a way to create a new Captain America type super soldier that could be used for whatever nefarious purposes Hydra wanted to use it for. And that the various projects that came along all sort of happened on the back end, sort of hidden away from sight. Nobody really knew about it. And then once Wolverine and Sabretooth and those guys become part of Team X, working for Hydra, albeit unwittingly, that Hydra realizes they've got powers and they take them and put them into Weapons Plus, the newest project being Weapons 10, right? Weapon X. So that's why that's so important, and that's why that would probably be the single most important part of this. Now, following this, we say a metallurgist and Hydra employee named Myron McClane is tasked with creating an indestructible metal far stronger and more durable than Wakandan vibranium. By whatever manner and whatever means, Myron McClane creates adamantium but is unable to duplicate the process. Now, I chose Myron McClane here because he was the creator of adamantium in Marvel Comics. That happened in Avengers Volume 1, issue number 66. Now, here's why this is important, and here's why this could have a huge impact on the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So the idea here was that in Marvel Comics, Steve Rogers had fought alongside Wakanda Wakanda against the Germans when they were trying to invade Africa. Now, at the time, Captain America's shield was in an iron form, and he was an iron shape, right? The old school Captain America comics from like 1940 that you guys see in the cover, it's literally in the shape of an iron. But when he was fighting with the Wakandans, he realized that while they did have shields, having a shield in the shape of a circle was far more versatile, that it could be used in a defensive capacity to block various attacks and things like that, but it could also be used offensively, throwing it at people, different things along those lines. And so what ended up happening here is that because of his efforts in fighting alongside the Wakandans, specifically the grandfather of T'Challa, I think it was, that Steve Rogers was rewarded with a shard of vibranium. And so what he did is he returned back to the United States and he told the US government to basically create a new shield that was round and then to put the vibranium inside of it. And so what ended up happening is the US government contracted a man named Myron McClane. And Myron McClane, much like the invention of penicillin, for example, had ended up creating Captain America's shield as it exists now by accident. That what ended up happening is he quite literally fell asleep behind the wheel. And that when he woke up, the Captain America's shield had solidified, but it was not composed exclusively of Wakandan vibranium. That instead, it actually turned out to be Wakandan vibranium and some other element that we weren't necessarily familiar with. Now, what we end up learning later on is that Captain America's shield is composed of Wakandan vibranium, steel, and a third element that no one's ever been able to discover. Presumably, it was adamantium, but nobody really knows for certain. The important thing behind this is that Myron McClane tried to duplicate Captain America's shield, and when he did, he was not able to copy it, but he created adamantium instead. And that's where adamantium comes from. That's why Myron McClane is chosen here. He's the guy who created it. But moving on, number 5. Team X is taken by Hydra and inducted into the Weapons Plus program as his 10th test or project, effectively rebranding Wolverine as Weapon X. Now, during the initial screening process, Hydra discovers the mutant gene within Wolverine, activates it, and finds that he has a healing factor. Adamantium, as it was created by Myron McClane, is bonded to his skeleton. Now, initially I put on here that this could be used to explain where Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver got their powers from. For Scarlet Witch, that doesn't apply anymore. We know that at the end of Wandavision, that her powers are basically the inherent ability to manipulate the various magical energies of the entirety of the universe. That's what makes her more powerful than Stephen Strange. But with Quicksilver, we don't know where he got his powers from. And so what we can say here is that Quicksilver is actually a mutant. He is a legitimate mutant, but unlike the Scarlet Witch, his powers were activated by virtue of Baron von Strucker's use of the Mind Stone from Loki's scepter. And that's where we can say that mutants have been popping up at different points in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We just didn't know what they were. And so finishing this off, the rest of the Wolverine series would follow Wolverine's exploits after escaping the Weapons Plus facility, eventually leading up to his meeting with Charles Xavier and joining the X-Men, which would allow the series to bookend directly into the X-Men film. However that film starts off, that's how we end the Wolverine series. But that's my idea for this, right? That's my whole idea for this. Let me know what you guys think. If there's anything that was a little confusing here, let me know down in the comment section. I'll do my best to expand on it and explain it a little bit better. But I think it was pretty straightforward here. I think we hit all the important points. One of the cool things about this too is I've actually got this for a bunch of different characters. I've got ideas like this for Magneto, for like Professor Xavier, for Colossus, for Nightcrawler, different things like that. It's just these ideas designed to kind of introduce these characters into the Marvel Cinematic Universe by giving them a Disney Plus series that helps to beef up whatever information we get in the various films that they have. If it's like a solo film or like just the overall X-Men film or something along those lines. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.